My background is this Shanghai Intercontinental. It's called a Wonderland. I don't know if you know about this place.
Oh,
It's kind of famous because it's strange in a way. It's built on an abandoned rock quarry near Shanghai, and it was designed by a British guy.
oh,
His name is Martin Jockman. The firm name is Atkins, supposedly very famous architecture firm.
okay.
They also designed the Dubai, this seven-star hotel, so it's an interesting
Oh,
place.
right, okay, interesting.
Yeah, I can't afford to live there, but we went there for lunch, so I took some pictures. So yeah,
Excellent. Right, very interesting.
yeah.
Gosh.
Anyway, um, Shanghai clearly has more. You can see more Westerners and foreigners on the street, so that's one thing,
Mm,
So
mm.
anyway, I'm sure there's some
Interesting.
British.
That is interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Well, of course, it's the city in China that I've been to,
Uh-huh.
particular specifically, and I did go to some of the places around. I went to Nanjing,
Uh-huh.
and which I loved, but I thought Nanjing was very, very relaxed, interesting city.
Hmm.
And I don't know whether I told you, we went to the Purple Mountain, we
Yeah.
visited the tomb of the first Ming Emperor,
Hmm.
and we also went to Sun Yat-sen's tomb. We were
Yeah.
the only Westerners there, lots and lots of Chinese people, but we were, Catherine and I were the only Westerners there, which surprised me actually.
Hmm.
And we did a lot of things that were connected to Sun Yat-sen when we were in Shanghai. We visited the house, the residence where his wife lived,
Uh-huh.
which because again we think very hard. You know, she was one of the three sisters, the one who chose to stay in China.
Hmm.
So we visited that, and and of course we visited the museum, which I think is one of the greatest art museums in the world. So
Hmm.
we saw an awful lot in Shanghai. We went to the Bund, obviously. We went to the place opposite. We saw all of those things, and and we went to Suzhou. Did I say we went to
Suzhou,
Suzhou
yeah.
too?
Hmm.
But so yeah, yeah. So I mean, Shanghai's about the one place in China that I know reasonably well. I
Hmm.
noticed that there were lots of young Westerners
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
I'm guessing teaching English, which is what
Yeah.
they all do. And I have to say, I wasn't impressed with them. I thought they were behaving in a rather rowdy way, in a
Hmm.
way that I didn't think was particularly popular with the Chinese people. But anyway, there it was.
Hmm. Anyway,
Mhm.
okay. So let's start with the U.S.-China relations. So
Mm.
Xi Jinping finally had a phone call with Trump. Trump has been wanting this phone call. And strangely, I couldn't find the readout from the White House. I find the readout from the
No,
Chinese government, but so there is no readout from the White House.
no, no.
Anyway, so what is your what do you get out of this their phone call? What's your
It,
impression?
it, it, it's getting very strange with this administration. They don't provide readouts on many important calls, and they absolutely have not provided one of the call between Trump and Xi Jinping.
Mhm.
All we have is Trump's own Truth Social
Mhm.
post,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
I don't know how reliable that is. But, um, well, there's a number of things to say. Trump said that it was a very friendly call
Mhm.
and that the two men get on. He said just before the call took place, he did another Truth Social post in which he said that Xi Jinping is extremely tough and very, very difficult to do terms
Mhm.
a deal with. That he likes him and always will. He said he
Mhm.
likes Xi Jinping and always will, but this is an extremely tough man. True,
Mhm.
that's another one thing you can absolutely agree with. Um, um, but the actual call itself was friendly. I read the Chinese readout, and I noticed that the section where they described what Trump said also seemed to suggest that it was a friendly
Mhm.
call. I mean, I think at a personal level, Trump and Xi Jinping, um, well, the relationship was a lot easier than it was between
Yeah.
Biden and Xi Jinping, to put it mildly.
Mhm.
So I think that part of it is true. I think in all other respects, China didn't give an inch. Xi Jinping didn't give an inch.
Mhm.
I think that what Trump was trying to do was to get the Geneva negotiations restarted, and they were restarted soon after.
Mhm.
I think he was trying to get Xi Jinping to relax restrictions on rare earths and
Mhm.
magnets and all of that, which clearly has become very serious matter for China. And I get the sense that Xi Jinping did agree to that, and we do seem to have had this deal done, which we'll come to shortly, in
Mhm.
London. But there was one particular passage that I thought was very interesting in the Chinese readout. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but it was one which said that China will, wants to deal with the United States, but will stick to its principles.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then Xi Jinping, then well, the readout says Xi Jinping basically set out what was going, what China expected. And I think there's a number of things that I took away from that. Firstly, that China will not be pushed around by the United States in
Mhm.
terms of the bilateral relationship and in terms of bilateral trade. Secondly, and I think this is a very important thing, which nobody's talking about, around the same time that this call took place, just before this telephone call took place, Lindsey Graham was talking about imposing sanctions, secondary sanctions on Russia,
Mhm.
which would mean 500% tariffs on any country that bought Russian energy products. Now, whilst he was in Kiev, he gave what I thought was an extremely ill-judged interview,
Mhm.
in which he made it absolutely clear, as far as I could see, that these aren't really sanctions against Russia at all.
Mhm.
They are tariffs against China. It's
Mhm.
an attempt basically to say we want to impose these massive tariffs on China, and we're going to use the excuse that the Chinese are importing energy products from Russia. So if one drop of oil, or what the Americans say is one drop of oil from Russia, somehow finds its way to China, you get
Mhm.
500% tariffs. And my own sense was that in careful Chinese diplomatic language, Xi
Mhm.
Jinping said to Donald Trump, "Don't you dare." And directly after, again, people have nobody's seen this. We did a program about this on the Duran, by the
Yeah, I saw
way.
that. Mhm.
Directly after the call, what starts to happen? The White House starts calling up Lindsey Graham, says, "You've got to soften these sanctions. We can't possibly have sanctions like this. It would box in, tie down the president. Let's change the wording and all of that."
Mhm.
And then we started to get reports from the Wall Street Journal that support for the sanctions package, which isn't really a sanctions
Mhm.
package, was melting away in Congress, and talk that it would be presented to the Senate this week. Um, well, it's not happened. So it seems to me that this is a classic example of China doing what I always said, calling someone's bluff.
Mhm.
Remember what I always say in diplomacy: the first law of war is don't march on Moscow.
Mhm.
The first law of diplomacy is don't bluff Beijing, because your bluff is always called.
Mhm.
So perhaps I'm reading more
Mhm.
into the readout than is there, but that was my sense of some of the language that came out. And I would be very surprised, if I have to be honest, if Xi Jinping didn't say something about Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill,
Mhm.
given the fact that it was obviously directed at China, not used. I mean, not really. It's not even really about Russia or Ukraine at all. If you actually follow this interview he gave.
Yeah, I will have a question about that bill later. Um, but I do
Mm.
want to say this, that in general, I feel like Trump always put a lot of emphasis on his personal approach or personal charm or ability or something. Whereas China the way China does things is okay, let the two delegations do their negotiations, right? And then the leaders will sign, whatever need to be signed. But Trump much more believing in, okay, Donald Trump come in, problem solved. Do you think still he has that mentality? Don't you think?
Yes, he does. Yes, he does, and it's a massive mistake. It's completely wrong. It originates from the world of commercial real estate, which is the one that he knows. He does the personal deal. He rocks up. He has the meeting. He overpowers the other person with the force of his personality. He pours in the charm. He does all of these things, and of course, that kind of I've said this many times. This kind of deal making works, no doubt, well
Mhm.
in that world of commercial real estate. It does not work at the level of negotiations between superpowers like the United States and China.
Mhm.
China just does not work in that way. I mean, that is absurd to think so. No great nation is going to let itself be charmed by one man into making concessions against its own interests. This isn't something that Trump seems to understand. So he always imagines he can pull this off that way, and it doesn't work like that.
And by the way, I don't think you overread it. I'm sure that what Lindsey Graham is doing, China pays close attention to it. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
get to it. Now, about those 2 days negotiation in London, uh, I think they concluded it now, right? It's done,
Yeah.
but I haven't seen any detailed official account of that. So there's a lot of
No.
speculation. But in general, can we say it basically goes back before April 2nd,
Yeah.
instead of like this 90 days pause? Now it seems like they have a deal, which is going back
Yeah.
before April the 2nd, right?
Yeah, it's an indefinite deal for the moment. This is my own sense. It's still not, despite what the Americans are trying to say, it's still not the final deal. It's still, we've still got tariffs on China's side,
Hmm.
tariffs on America's side.
Yeah.
So the ones that were, that Trump has been talking about, the reciprocal ones that China put in. There has been some watering down, quite a lot of watering down actually, on the
Mhm.
American side. I mean, the Americans are allowing all sorts of goods from China to enter the United States because Walmart told Trump some time ago, we've got to have that happen. And the Americans have clearly made some concessions in order to get the Chinese to agree to start supplying certain rare earths and certain types of magnets. The reason we are not getting the full details is because the Americans don't want us to see what concessions they've made. That's the only reason. I mean, China has no reason to keep things secret in that way. That isn't China's way. So you can be certain it's the Americans who have asked to keep this thing secret because they don't want people to see that actually they made many, many, many more concessions than they want to admit to.
Yeah.
Um, that's the American side. I mean, the Americans are all about, contrary to what people say, China is not all about face. America is all about face. But in theory and logically, there ought to be a much more detailed negotiation going forward with the United States and China to sort out the trading relationship in the future. My own sense, and again, I may be looking at this too much from a Western perspective, and I don't know what the internal conversation is in China. I think the Chinese have gradually come to understand, or at least have come to a decision, that this is a hopeless exercise,
Mhm.
that trying to negotiate a long-term trade deal, a proper long-term trade treaty with the United States, it's never going to work. The Americans will make promises. They'll say one thing one day, do something else the next day. It will be China will be kept constantly played with as the Americans treat those negotiations as an issue within their own domestic politics. So what the Chinese are now doing is that they're coming up with this arrangement, this agreement that was reached in London, which is an indefinite one, and within which China can work. I mean, they can live with this. And in the meantime, they're going to do all the necessary things they need to do within China itself, with China's trade partners, with ASEAN, with
Hmm.
BRICS. They're going to develop their civil aviation industry, which is now moving forward by leaps and bounds. They're going to do all of those things, and they're going to stop worrying so much about the United States. So it's basically, for China now, it's a transitional arrangement
Hmm.
for China to start scaling down its own trade, its own importance with the economic relationship with the United States. Can I just tell you where I think, give you a sense of how I think the change has come?
Hmm.
I mentioned before we started this program that I'd visited Shanghai in 2017. Now, one of the reasons I went there was that one of my best friends, a very long-standing friend, who's Russian,
Hmm.
was at that time heading the VTB branch, which is a Russian bank branch in Shanghai. And I went there, and he said it was very, very interesting. When the Russian consulate has parties, it's intellectuals, it's diplomats, it's people from the military from China who attend. When it's the Americans hold parties, it's business people. Russia has never been able to get Chinese business people to take Russia seriously,
Hmm.
whereas they all focus on the United States.
Okay.
I don't think that's true any longer.
Yeah.
I think that has changed. I think people in China now realize this is a period
Hmm.
in China's history. China has all the resources and all the means to move on.
Yeah. Now, you're mentioning that Trump announced different things on his Truth Social, right? So one of the things he claimed on his Truth Social is that this negotiation is done and it's a great success. Of course, the U.S. imposes 55% of the Chinese goods and Chinese imposes 10%. Well, people break it down. The 55% actually included the existing. Remember he put in
Yeah.
the tariffs from last term. And plus, there's one thing I think the one of the drugs that he put on the fentanyl that he was putting on 25% or something. So all the other things are 10%. So it's pretty much 10% from both sides. And the rest of them, he added a little bit more things, make it look like a 55%, but it's not entirely true.
This is all over the British media, by the way. Bear in mind, they don't like Donald Trump. So this is one instance when they fact checked him correctly. It's all over it. And so, and I think even the Financial Times has been making that very, very same point. I really wish Trump would stop doing this,
Yeah.
actually. He's not, of course, the only American who does.
Uh-huh.
But this constant overhyping of agreements that are made with the other side. Americans always forget that there is another side. People in China read these things. They know that this isn't true. But I mean, it must further undermine belief in China that a long-term agreement with the United States is possible when the
Mhm.
president of the United States is basically lying about the agreement that's already been reached. Why take him seriously in terms of future negotiations?
Now, one thing the Chinese media did point out one thing is that Trump, this negotiation does give Trump something that he could now moving on with other nations, with other countries. And so, because the other countries are not so urgent, right? With China, it seems like this rare earth is really urgent. It's really hurting the United States. And now that he could, at least for the moment, my understanding is the military rare earth is still under strict control. The civilian part,
Oh,
like a
yeah,
automobile, for example, those
yeah,
productions, and so those are resuming gradually, not immediately, but gradually will resume. So that, like a crisis, that's what pumped Trump must have some concessions to China. But other countries don't have that kind of a leverage against the U.S. And so U.S. now can, have the time and energy now to work with other nations. So in that sense, it's good for Trump to have some deal, whatever that is, whether China wins or loses or U.S. wins or loses. It's good to have some deal with China, isn't it?
It is absolutely essential for the United States to have some deal with China. It's not good for them. They have no choice. If they didn't have a deal, if the restrictions on magnets and rare earths continued, then the supply chains would all start to block up. There was a big lead article in the Financial Times about this very thing. The entire US automobile industry, which is absolutely critical to the US economy, the industrial economy, what's left of it, would come to a grinding stop. So absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't say that this was good for him. I'd say it was essential for him. I mean, imagine what would have happened if there had not been a deal like this. That's why he's calling Xi Jinping. It wasn't Xi Jinping who wanted to call him. It was Donald Trump who wanted to call Xi Jinping. And you're absolutely right. The military, rare earths and all of that, they're still restricted. And there is no plan actually in the United States about what to do with this. Now, a couple of days ago, by the way, the Russians did announce a plan to develop their own rare earths industry, which is very much part of their ideas about sovereignty. I looked at it. It's a 15-year program. It's a very detailed program about what they're going to be doing over 15 years. Do you see anything like that coming out of the United States? No. So I mean, this is and anyway, I mean, they don't have 15 years because they have to trade with China until that point is reached. So absolutely, he definitely, completely needed that deal. And coming to what you said just now about how this makes it easier for him to do deals with other countries, that is true. But think again about what that means. It's the exact reverse of what they were saying back in March and April. At that time, they were saying, well, we're going to impose all these enormous restrictions on China. And then we're going to do all of these deals with all of these other countries. And we are going to isolate that China in that way. Now they have to do a deal with China, in effect, to prevent themselves from being isolated because no one wants to do deals with them, or there isn't the urgency to do the deals with them until the deal with China is sorted out. It shows you where the real balance of economic power is and where the real resolve is. So, yes, that is absolutely true, but that is a 180-degree reverse for the United States. They are, instead of, as I said, doing deals with other countries in order to put pressure on China, they're having to do a deal with China in order to be able to find the time and space to do deals with the other countries. It shows how chaotic decision making in the United States has become. It also shows something else, that the one thing that the United States is still able to do is maintain tight information control. Because if all of this were being discussed openly in the United States in the way that we are doing now, well, you can imagine what the American people would be saying.
Now, come to this Lindsey Graham bill. He co-sponsored with Richard Blumenthal. I think it's called the Russian Sanction Act 2025. Well, we just talked about how hard it is for Trump to deal with China. They don't see this. They still want to use like giving Trump additional way to, I guess, sanction China. What's the thinking behind this bill, Lindsey Graham? What's the deal?
Well, I come back to what I've said many times, that ultimately in the United States, everything in the end comes back to China. I mean, the Americans are fixated with China to an extent which I'm afraid I don't think even now Chinese people fully understand. I mean, everything, the entire world, the way they see the world revolves around China. So this is a typical example of American politics. So you assemble a support for a bill, you tell everybody that it's about Russia. It's actually about China at the end of the day. Now, I think that what this was ultimately about, it was more about politics, because I think even Lindsey Graham is intelligent enough maybe he's not. But anyway, I think he's intelligent enough to understand that in the end, there was no way this could fly. I mean, the United States almost destroyed its own economy when it had 145% tariffs against China. If it went to 500% tariffs against China with legislation behind them, making it very, very difficult to relax them, we would have an absolute economic meltdown in the United States. I think what this is Lindsey Graham again basically threatening Trump. He represents the military-industrial complex, the hardliners in the political system, the foreign policy hardliners in the political system, the people who are yearning to hit back at China and to defend Taiwan. And Lindsey Graham is very, very tough on Taiwan. The people who don't want any concessions to be made to Russia at all. So what Lindsey Graham is saying to Trump is, under no circumstances make any kind of concessions to China on tariffs. Never, don't make any concessions to Russia on questions of Ukraine. Don't make any concessions to China on the question of Taiwan. Take no step at all towards a real understanding with these two countries, because if you do, we've got 81 senators in the Senate. They're not just enough to override your veto on bills. Potentially, they're enough to impeach you. I think that is what that was all about. And also a little bit of Lindsey Graham himself grandstanding and keeping himself in the spotlight and in the news. It was a tawdry political maneuver, and I think time has been called on it. But note again that it took Xi Jinping to do it. I mean, Trump himself didn't come out immediately and say to Lindsey Graham, this bill is nonsense. He didn't call in the senators and say, for God's sake, what are you doing here? This is madness. It required Xi Jinping to explain it all, or at least this is my own belief, to Donald Trump, for Donald Trump finally to summon up the will to call, or rather to send his people to talk to Lindsey Graham and tell him this isn't going to work.
Well, this is what Rand Paul said. He said this bill, he's calling it literally the most ill-conceived bill I have ever seen in Washington. He said it would be worldwide embargo on 36 countries. So in the midst of this China-US, it also involves other countries because the bill is saying, because it's secondary sanctions, so it's not just China buying things from Russia, but also, I guess, 36 other countries. So, but in spite of that, like you said, there are 81 co-sponsors for this bill. Do you think they're going to water it down, or I don't think they're going to abandon this bill, though, since they have so many, people sponsor it.
Yes, they are. This is what they're going to do. They're going to water it down. So instead of must, it'll be may.
Okay.
Instead of can, or rather, will, it will become can, and all of that kind of thing, which will then throw it back to Trump. And that changes in legal substantive terms absolutely nothing. Because as we've seen, if Donald Trump wants to impose 500% tariffs on China and say that these are secondary sanctions against Russia, in theory, he can do it anyway without needing this bill to be passed at all. I mean, that's the United States has passed sanctions after sanctions in this exact manner through executive orders. It's also disregarded Congress in imposing tariffs. It's now going all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, but most people believe that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to support Trump here. So it wouldn't change anything. But it, of course, will, and by the way, I agree with you. I think this bill will pass. I think it will be watered down. I don't think it will be abandoned entirely. And I'm afraid, I think that plants a bomb underneath the whole trade foreign policy system, because the Russians will continue in Ukraine. The narrative that China is helping Russia will continue to rumble crumble away, and you'll have all the hardliners, and they will say, look, we've passed this bill through Congress. Donald Trump has all the powers that he needs to bring Russia and China into line. Why is he not exercising it? Is he weak? Is he unable to act decisively or firmly? It will enable all the usual terrible people to behave in all the awful way that they always do. And I'm afraid that's what Lindsey Graham has done. And Donald Trump is at fault for this. A strong president would have said right away, I don't like this bill. This bill is wrong at multiple levels. It's probably unconstitutional because it binds my hands. I certainly don't support it. And if it comes to me, I will veto it. Even and if 81 senators are stupid enough to back it, so much the worse for them. I am confident that the Republicans in the House will not support it. And if he'd said that, the whole thing would have collapsed like a house of cards. He's now, as I said, going to have this bill, and it's going to be a bomb, as I said, planted beneath the whole foreign policy system. And that sooner or later, it could quite easily explode.
Yeah. Yeah, we will see. We'll see what the end bill look like and how are they going to
eventually.
Yeah. Okay. The riots in Los Angeles. So I think in the beginning I didn't pay much attention because these kind of riots it happens, protests, but it seems like it's getting bigger and bigger than what I thought in the beginning. Now in China, people always, when there is a protest and riots like that, they always cite Nancy Pelosi when something happened, years ago in Hong Kong. Nancy Pelosi's word was, "It's a beautiful sight to behold." Okay, so right now, the beautiful sight to behold again in the United States. I did see some social media people doing some analysis, not the mainstream. They're saying actually there might be the FBI involvement in this to make it bigger, more uncontrolled, so that Trump could insert more authority and, things like that. So what's your take on the whole thing?
Right. I mean, the first thing to say, and I'm going to say, I don't agree with the Chinese people about this. I don't think these things are a beautiful sight to behold. I didn't think they were a beautiful sight to behold in Hong Kong. I thought they were a hideous and horrible sight to behold in Hong Kong. And I think they're a hideous and horrible sight to behold in Los Angeles. I mean, I think these are terrible things. And I mean, we should say so. I mean, I say so. I mean, rioting is ugly. And when it happens for some kind of democratic political cause, they become even more ugly, frankly. And I don't know who is behind these riots, whether it's the FBI and Donald Trump and his agencies. I think that's slightly unlikely, by the way, or whether it's Donald Trump's opponents, or whether it's some of the cartels, the drugs people who run drugs and who have particular reasons to keep things as they are. But they sting of organization. I mean, there's clearly somebody behind this. Again, I'm not unfamiliar with riots. As you probably know, I was for 12 years. I used to work in the Royal Courts of Justice, and I used to have to deal with all kinds of things involving rioting and all of that. I can always tell when there's a spontaneous riot. Spontaneous riots basically never happen, can I just say? There's nearly always someone behind them who is organizing them. In Britain, when they happen, it's usually criminal activity that is behind them. Criminals trying to distract the police and keep them away from investigating things close to themselves. But this is on a much bigger scale. But somebody's clearly organizing these things. Somebody clearly has an agenda behind them. That was absolutely the case, by the way, with the riots in Hong Kong. And we know exactly who was behind those riots, just to say. I mean, when Nancy Pelosi was saying that these were beautiful things, well, they were beautiful things because she was part of organizing them, to say it straightforwardly. But I don't know who exactly is organizing these, but they bear all the hallmarks, not just of organization, but of a very large scale organization indeed. The riots in Xinjiang are
Uh-huh.
organized too when they
Yeah.
happen. There
Hmm.
are always people who organize these things. Right, the idea of spontaneous riots is a complete myth. There
Yeah.
is no reality to that. If you go back in history, throughout history, there is never any such thing as a spontaneous riot. There
Mhm.
is always someone there behind them who is organizing them. And that always means an organization.
Yeah.
And as in Hong Kong, it's not difficult to work out in the event that there's riots in Xinjiang, who is involved there.
Well, the reason is that people really hate Nancy Pelosi when she said it is a beautiful
Yeah.
sight to
Yeah.
behold. You know, yeah,
I know why people say that in
yeah.
China. I completely understand. They're pointing the finger. But having said that, I mean, I think I on my side, I want to say this. I mean, I hated what happened in
Yeah.
Hong Kong. I went
Hmm.
on a far out on a limb to say that at the time. By the way, I lost some friends. Just to say, I'm not going to lose any friends over the riots in LA because the kind of people who would have been annoyed with me have long since stopped being my friends. But these are horrible things too. Whoever it is who's behind them.
Yeah, and the reason some people are speculating. I mean, they are, the social media people that I normally trust, like Jimmy Dore and Kim Iverson. They were speculating some FBI involvement. Remember January 6th, right? January 6th was, I think it started the
Yeah,
MAGA people protesting organically, but they were peaceful. And then later it turned more, physical.
yeah,
That's because they were provoked. There were people inside. They were FBI agents mixed in, and then
yes,
it become more aggressive. And
yes,
so some people are saying whether that is
yes,
also what's
yes.
going on. Now, this time, of course, at the table turn, they think it's maybe not necessarily Trump himself, but people around him thinking that this is a good
Yeah,
opportunity for him to put in more authority. In particular, he doesn't like California, right? So this is the opportunity for him to
yeah,
kind of control California and give them a lesson, stuff like that.
mm,
So that he could, getting more power to himself. One thing that in his Big and Beautiful bill, for example, he wanted more budget for the ICE, for round up,
yeah,
illegal immigrants. So he wanted more budget, and that's one of the things that people. His Big Beautiful bill encounters some problems. That's one of them. The other thing is he also in that Big Beautiful bill that he wanted to ban local and state authorities from prohibiting private entities to collect citizen data. So that's in particular like companies like Palantir, right? So he has some friends that would like this big beautiful bill to pass, so they benefit from it, and then there are people who don't like parts of it. So this is a good opportunity for him to show the world, you see, these people are out of control, and the
yeah,
California governor and of course Los Angeles mayor, they're incompetent. So it's better the federal government coming in, have more budget and have more power to rein in on these situations. So that's the
yeah.
the speculations behind it. I think there's some
No,
truth.
quite possibly. I mean, the only thing that makes me slightly hold back on that because you're setting out very well
Mhm.
how it could all be.
Mhm.
And can I just also say, I think that the big political beneficiary of these riots is going to be Donald Trump for precisely the reason you said. I mean, people like Newsom and all of
Mhm.
the others have been put, I think, in a very difficult position because, I mean, there's rioting and there's violence, and they're appearing to defend it, and they're defending it in an American city. And maybe there are many people in California who agree with them, but I don't think many people I don't think most people in the United States, wider United States, do. So I think they're looking now to Trump as the figure of authority who's going to assert control and all of that. Now, the one reason why I'm holding back a little on
Mhm.
endorsing that is two things. First of all, there is the intelligent intellectual argument against this, which I suspect has little relevance, which is that no government should ever foment riots
Mhm.
against itself, because after all, I mean, the riots are always against the government. And I mean, I think the idea of fomenting riots is what stupid governments do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing to say. Now, I don't push that too far, because in America they take their internal stability so much for granted
Mm-hmm.
that they are prepared to do stupid things in order to win their domestic problems. So that's for what it's worth. I think it's a point that should be made. The second point is that I think Trump is such a chaotic individual. He's so disorganized himself that to expect him and his immediate entourage to come up with a plan as sophisticated as this, and to be able to execute it without leaks and people running off to the media and talking about it all over the place. I mean, it just is expecting rather a lot. But that's Trump himself and his immediate entourage. Some of the people that are a little bit further away from Trump, and I don't want to name any names. Well, I will name one. I mean, Peter Thiel, for example. I mean, I think he's perfectly capable of dreaming up something like this. I'm not saying he has, by the way, and I want to make that absolutely clear. And in fact, probably he hasn't. But there are other people who might be involved with Trump in some way who could perhaps come up with something of this kind. But Trump himself, as I said, just seems to me too disorganized and chaotic to come up with something like this. I mean, bear in mind, this is a man who apparently doesn't read his intelligence briefs. So thinking that he's capable of planning, I mean, Lyndon Johnson might have done it. Richard Nixon might have done it. Perhaps even Bill Clinton could have. But Donald Trump, I put a big question mark next to it.
Yeah. But it is Churchill who said, famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So.
Oh no, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is where I think that's what he's doing. I think he's seeing this as a good crisis, and from his point of view, it's pure gold. I mean, it gives him huge opportunities to assert himself in California, to deploy troops onto the streets of the United States, to present himself as the symbol of authority and of law and order, and it will work for him.
Yeah. Okay, to the Middle East. So Mike Huckabee, who is the U.S. ambassador to Israel, he now has said that the U.S. is no longer pursuing the goal of an independent Palestinian state, which officially abandoning the cornerstone of the U.S. Middle East policy, isn't it? I'm surprised it's not more discussions. And he even said that any future Palestinian state should be carved out of a Muslim country. Basically, the two-stage solution that the U.S. officially have been endorsed all these years is coming to an end. Is it?
It is coming to an end. It is dead. My own personal view is that it died years ago, because Israel is implacably opposed to it, and the United States, in reality, has never supported it. I mean, they've gone through the motions of pretending that they support it. So in a kind of a sense, this has brought clarity. Okay. And I get to say this as well. What the administration is doing, they may not have understood that, is that they have signed the death of Israel, because this is an unsustainable situation. Sooner or later, something is going to happen. Either Israel is going to start expelling the entire population and committing not just the kind of slow genocide that it's doing now, but an outright genocide, in which case that will destroy Israel. I mean, it will not. I mean, it will become a utterly unacceptable country for most of the world, and that could probably escalate into a bigger crisis. Or more likely, it will evolve into an apartheid state. Further down the road, people will start to speak more straightforwardly of it being an apartheid state. We will have again the return of a resolution that the General Assembly passed back in the 1970s, which was then cancelled in the 1990s, saying that Zionism was a form of racism, supported by China, by the way. We will have it come back, and sooner or later, the pressures, as with South Africa, will grow to the point where they will have to grant equal rights to the Palestinians, in which case it will cease to be a Jewish state anymore. So this was Israel's escape route. The two-state solution was an escape route for preserving a Jewish state on the territory of Palestine. The Americans have just shut the door on it.
Now, Ukraine and the Russian situation, when we're talking about the phone calls between Trump and Xi Jinping, it reminds me the phone call he had with the Putin, right? It was also a friendly call, but Putin also didn't give in much, right? Isn't it? So there's not a whole lot there happening there, and Russian continue moving forward. The latest we know is that Ukraine refused to take 6,000 soldiers, Ukraine soldiers' body back. Why? Is it just because they don't want to pay, or why do they refuse to do that?
Yeah, first of all, was it even a friendly call? This gives you a sense of how crazy things are. Because it was a week before that Trump said that Putin has gone crazy. He's killing people all over the place, and then a couple of days later he telephones me. Oh, I had a really friendly call with this crazy man. I mean, it changes from one day to another, and it hardly makes any sense anymore. And anybody who takes what Trump says seriously and assumes that you can build an understanding of US foreign policy from Trump's words is I think deluding themselves. Anyway, I'm not sure it was such a friendly call. Now, what had happened was this. There was this Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian air bases. Contrary to what some people are insisting, I have absolutely no doubt that the Americans were in it up to their ears, and the British even more so. I mean, they were all in it up to their absolute ears, and they didn't understand that what they did was a massive violation of the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is the only major treaty that continues to exist between Russia and the United States on strategic weapons. That the Americans are desperate to get the Russians to agree to extend the START Treaty at the end of the year and to begin negotiations on strategic arms limitation. And the reason they want that is because not only does Russia have a bigger nuclear force than the United States does, but the Americans are also very concerned now that they've landed themselves into an arms race with China as well. So they want to get the Russians to agree to limit their arms, and then they want the Russians to persuade the Chinese to join the Russians and the Americans in agreeing to arms limitation, which some of the Russians up to now are refusing to do. But that's another complex story. Anyway, the point is that after this attack, which the Russians believe the Americans were involved in, an attack which violates the terms of the START Treaty, it is becoming increasingly unlikely that the Russians will agree to renew the START Treaty when it expires at the end of this year. So the Americans completely didn't see that. And then a number of American generals who are retired American generals, people like Michael Flynn and Blaine Holt, came out and pointed this out. And Trump, at that point, as he often does, gets scared. And he telephoned Putin and he said, look, I wasn't involved. It was nothing to do with me. I didn't know anything about it. Nobody in the United States knew anything about it. It was these crazy people in Ukraine. And the Russians have not provided a readout, which is interesting in itself. But Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, provided an account of the call. And my impression was, from reading Ushakov's account, and I'm very familiar with Russian readouts. I'm much more familiar with Russian readouts than with Chinese ones. My impression was that Putin heard Trump out in icy silence. I think that was what really happened. I mean, he heard what Trump had to say. He heard about Trump's denials that the Americans were involved. He clearly doesn't believe them. If you go to the Russian media, they clearly don't believe it. They are absolutely furious. I think they're furious with the Americans at many levels, by the way. And the Russians said, look, we are going to retaliate. We're not going to retaliate, perhaps in some of the ways that you fear, but they made no commitments about the START treaty, which is what the Americans were really, really worried about. So I think that was what actually happened. Now, the one thing that has come out of this, though, is that the Americans do seem to be very, very annoyed, probably with themselves, but also with the Ukrainians for doing all of these things. And they're now saying again that they're pulling out of the war and that they're giving the Russians the green light. And of course, they're not going ahead with Lindsey Graham's crazy sanctions and all of those things. So that gives the Russians the opportunity to just go on doing what they're doing and winning the war in Ukraine. Now, as for the Ukrainians, the reason they are not prepared to accept these 6,000 dead soldiers, which is shocking, actually. It's really, really bad. It is deeply shocking. Firstly, money does play a significant part in it. Apparently, to pay compensation to all the dead, to the families of the dead soldiers, would eat up around 10%. Of these 6,000 soldiers would eat up around 10% of the defense budget, which is unaffordable, given that Ukraine is already running a massive budget deficit and is dependent on external funding. But there is something else, which is that, of course, it would essentially admit that Ukrainian casualties are much, much higher than the Ukrainian government wants to admit. Because one of the things that the international media isn't picking up, but which is being discussed in Russia, is that it seems that these 6,000 dead bodies were of Ukrainian soldiers collected in one particular location, which was Kursk. So it is not bodies of soldiers right across the entire front line.
Well, but if they refuse, isn't that admission that it is worse than they admitted to, and they won't pay? I mean, either way, it doesn't make Ukraine government good anyway.
No, it doesn't make them look good. But they're spinning all sorts of stories. They're saying we don't really know who these people are. The Russians haven't provided all identity detail. Maybe they're not even Ukrainians. I mean, they just do all of the. Whereas if they were to receive those bodies and the usual DNA tests were done and they were identified, which they would be because presumably external agencies like the Red Cross would become involved, then it would be more difficult to deny the truth. It is a very ugly story, actually, and it's not creating a good impression in Ukraine at all, as I understand it.
Well, now, one thing Trump is very good at is picking up fight with everybody. So one of the people that he was fighting with is with Harvard University. I'm a little bit curious about how you feel about that because your wife is a academia, my husband is an academia, so I pay attention to these kind of things. Now, regarding Harvard, I just want to share with you my own feelings, right? If just the pure numbers, Harvard University's budget, and this is a private company, a private university, is very rich. It has a huge endowment, and yet every year now Trump, I think the latest was unfrozen this 2.2 billion to Harvard. Same size public schools budget is somewhere between $300 to $700 million, which means Harvard cost is at least 3 times as much. Depends on, because liberal arts is cheaper than science and technology kind of universities. In any event, Harvard, and not just Harvard, but Ivy Leagues in general, they cost way more to run than a public school. And then what kind of people do they educate, really, honestly? So I don't feel particularly bad for Harvard on this one. What do you feel?
No, exactly the same. I mean, I should say when I was recently in Georgia and I met some people from Tufts, which is another Ivy League place. And by the way, they were pretty I think they understood that they were not going to be very popular with people in the United States, and that they were going to have a great deal of trouble justifying their funding. As you rightly say, these are the richest educational institutions in the world. I think Harvard is. I mean, the endowment in Harvard is enormous.
Yeah.
I wasn't even aware that it was getting public funding, that it was doing so on this kind of scale. I mean, it seemed to me completely bizarre. And logically, it is a massive misallocation of resources.
Mhm.
I mean, there are all sorts of other places which need this money a lot more. And again, it's what happens. It's not just the United States. It's the elite taking care of itself, basically. I mean, the rich people who send their children to Harvard, Yale,
Mhm.
Tufts, Princeton, all of the Columbia, all of the rest. They're making sure that these places continue to get all the money that they not need but want.
Mhm.
They then come out with their glittering qualifications and degrees and things, which objectively may not be very much better than the degrees that much, much cheaper institutions provide. But then they get parachuted into big law firms, big executive positions, strong positions in government, all that kind of thing. And as I said, it's the same with Oxford and Cambridge, which are also rich institutions, and they're also immensely well funded. And I'm sure it's the same in other places around the world as well. The United States has completely messed up its educational system. Just to say, um, um, back in the early 20th century, I believe I'm right in saying that it was the best educated society in the world. I mean, there were schools. I mean, secondary schools in the United States were much better than in Europe.
Mhm.
And now they're probably much worse than in Europe. The university system in the US was considered outstanding. They had brilliant engineering and science schools. They had very strong vocational schools, especially at tertiary level. The university my wife goes to,
Mhm.
my wife is an academic in, is a former American vocational school. But of course, it
Mhm.
ceased to be that a long time ago. And anyway, they had a very comprehensive, very well organized, very well run uh, education system operating at the highest levels. And they've completely messed it up. They've messed it up because distortions in funding. They've applied very strange policies. They are obsessed with STEM. China is not obsessed with STEM. It
Mhm.
just does STEM. I mean, that's the difference. I mean, America is, I mean, the Americans and the British even more want to dragoon everybody into doing STEM subjects, neglect, unbalancing all of the others. In Britain, all the English literature departments, for example, outside Oxford and Cambridge, where again the elite people go, are closing down because everybody must do STEM, even people who don't want to do STEM. So they want to compete with China about STEM. Everybody says this, by the way. We
Mhm.
have to compete with China on STEM. China produces 500,000 STEM graduates, so we must do that. We must do that too, which cannot be done. And as I said, forcing people to do STEM when they don't want to is
Mhm.
stupid. But and you're not doing it anywhere the right way, which is that the way you do it is by developing your maths departments. Um, can I just say this? Once upon a time, this is again something I know. Once upon a time, 10, 15 years ago, you had lots of Chinese students coming to Cambridge in London, in Britain, rather saying, sorry, in order to study mathematics. And you had people say at that time in Britain, well, these are really, really very, very good students, but Chinese training in mathematics has its rigidities, which we don't have in Britain. Nobody says that any longer. Now it's acknowledged that, in fact, that isn't true anymore. And in
Mhm.
fact, the number of Chinese students coming to Cambridge to study mathematics is shrinking because
Yeah.
they're doing better in China. So,
Mhm.
so that's the way you build this all up. But anyway, the Americans who had wonderful science, engineering, vocational schools have unbalanced everything, and they've launched DEI on themselves. And again, because my wife and your husband presumably are familiar with all of this, you know how incredibly complicated that is and how burdensome that can become. So, I mean, they've done all of this to themselves, and they've taken a superb education system, which they once had, and they've wrecked it.
And then just the past few days, June 7th, 8th, and 9th, there was Gaokao, the college entrance exam in China. That's a big, big deal every year. Because for most people, that's your way
Yeah.
to, get into a good college and change your life. And you can come in from pretty humble background, and if you do well, you can change your life. So that's the big thing. And every time, this time of the year, I always thinking like universities like Harvard, they always make this application process overly complicated, right? They want you to
Yes.
write essay about yourself. I mean, a 17-year-old, what do you expect from this person? How
Yeah,
much more to
exactly.
write about, right?
It's all phony anyway. I mean, this is something again I can say from direct knowledge, because the reality is that obviously they get all these essays and they do no doubt read them, but the fact is that's not the criteria on which people decide who is going to go to Harvard. I mean, no doubt you will get an absolutely brilliant essay, from somebody who might not otherwise get to Harvard, and that they will go to Harvard. But generally, that isn't the real criteria that's ever followed. I mean, they look at other things, and we all know that. So it's again, it's a it's I'm going to say it's a con
Mhm,
of
mhm.
the students
Yeah.
who are put through the trouble of writing these things. As you rightly say, in China is much, much more straightforward. But China
Mhm.
and the Chinese people do not need to be incentivized to study, because China has always taken, throughout its enormously long history, education extremely seriously. I mean, heavens knows China was the country that invented the idea of examinations and, with the examination system. Whereas in Britain and in the United States, there is a very, very strong anti intellectual tradition,
Mm.
which I think Chinese people would find incomprehensible. The idea that, you know, being ignorant is somehow good, and being coarse and not being interested in things. I think in China nobody could understand that, would be able to understand that, because it is so completely contrary to the civilization.
One more thing is that maybe it's a coincidence. It's interesting that Japan recently, the government worked with the city of Shimonoseki. They exhibited the original copies of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. And as you know, China
Oh,
had this 24 unfair and just treaties. So one of them is this Japanese one. And the British
yeah.
Museum also, around the same time, under this theme called China's Hidden History, they exhibited the original copy of the Treaty of Nanking. Okay, so that got lots of attention in China. It was like, why are they doing this? Are they trying to remind us our past humiliations? Or they simply want to feel good about themselves that they once upon a time they were powerful, they could conquer and colonize China. What's your take on that? Why are they doing this?
That's very well. That's very interesting. And you said that China's hidden history, because of course this exhibition has been very hidden in Britain.
Okay.
It's not been very, very widely publicized. I didn't know about it, but then, of course, I've been away. So,
Mhm.
but I absolutely think that. I think that it is intended partly as to remind China that, there was a period of time when, we were strong and you were weak, and that might come again. But I think it's even more about giving ourselves self-confidence, saying, the Chinese can be beaten. We beat them in the past. We can beat them again. It's all about that at the end of the day. I have to say, given what a horrible period that was, given what an ugly part of our history in Britain that was, that we would want to draw attention to it in that kind of way seems to me very, very surprising. I think if you want to commemorate that period of history, by all means do. And I think perhaps British people should be better informed. In fact, they definitely should be far better informed about it. But I would go about doing it in a completely different way. And obviously, seeking a Chinese contribution, getting China to cooperate, to work together with Britain with this exhibition, so that the British are fully informed about what all of these actions meant for China. Just to say.
Well, actually, the discussions in Chinese social media among the netizens is this, that China is never afraid of being reminded that China was, poor and weak and backwards in the past. China is afraid that this part of the history is not is forgotten by the future generations. So that's actually, it's a good thing that you keep on reminding us at that one, point that China was poor and weak, and that's what happened, and so we cannot let it happen again. So in order to not let it happen again, China need to continue to work hard, study hard, being reminded, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what young people in particular expected to do. So it's just a very different kinds of mentality, I guess, if their goal is to. The Indian also exhibited some pictures of at one point, toward the end of the Qing dynasty, I guess there's some Indian soldiers coming in to China together with the British, I guess, and they were prison guard of something. So they were guarding some prisoners. So it's kind of like a humiliating picture. India
No,
also.
I can actually discuss the second part because I know about it. I mean, that was there were Indian troops of the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, who were deployed to China, to Beijing, in 1900 at the time of the uprising of the men with the righteous fists or whatever it is. The people the West calls the Boxers, exactly. So that's probably what that is all about. But which is interesting. India celebrating a colonial enterprise by the British. It doesn't seem to make very much sense to me. The idea, absolutely, I agree. I don't think the Chinese people, far from being embarrassed by this episode, as you absolutely rightly say, I think the Chinese people, for them, this is a very, very vivid memory. I don't think it's ever been forgotten. I don't think it ever will be forgotten in China. China never forgets its history. I mean, that's another thing to say. I mean, this is the most historically minded nation on earth. It's one that takes history incredibly seriously. So absolutely, they do not want to be reminded of it. If they see that others are reviving their own narratives about it, then I think that is important for China because it tells them a lot about these other people. But I don't think China will ever forget this. I mean, they remember so much of their history, and it is so important to them. Here, by the way, there's a difference with India. India has no very clear historical narrative about itself at all. The Indians are all about philosophy and mathematics and that kind of thing, but they never developed a proper narrative history, so that there are huge uncertainties about dates. I mean, I know this because I did Indian history at one time. So, for example, whole dynasties, there is uncertainty whether they were, there could be differences of hundreds of years between scholars as to which period of Indian history in which to locate them. China isn't like that at all. I mean, you can work out what was happening in the court of the emperor sometimes on any particular day, 800 years ago. And I understand that the regional records from the time of the Ming Dynasty are almost as comprehensive.
Yeah, there's a lot of regional museums and lots of And I agree with you. I think it would be good if Britain, the British Museum want to exhibit something related to Chinese history to involve China. That would be a good thing. Both sides do something together, to remember that.
Virtually nobody I know in Britain knows about this. I mean, the British people are completely ignorant, or not completely, but they are overwhelmingly ignorant about this whole story.
Mhm.
By the way, about 5 minutes walk from my house, there is a cemetery, and in it there is a monument that commemorates a journalist of the London Times
Mhm.
who went to China with the Elgin expedition of 1860 when they burnt down the palace, the
Mhm.
emperor's palace. So you can find monuments and relics to this all over Britain. And as I've said previously, British stately homes, palaces are stuffed with Chinese porcelain, which is looted from China during all of these various expeditions. But the historic memory in Britain of all of these events doesn't exist. Say this China's hidden history. It's not true. It's our hidden history.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Okay, with that, let's talk again next week. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Mhm.
Have,
Bye.
bye. Bye.